Well, one thing that's become quite clear over the last few days here in DC with Prime Minister Modi in town is that this relationship is really in a very strong place. It's no surprise to anyone, but it seems that there's been a lot of momentum in a variety of different areas just over the last few months alone. Tech cooperation, clean energy cooperation, and of course there were several new defense deals that were signed, including this big package to send drones to India. And so I think that this has clearly reached the point where it is very much a multifaceted strategic partnership. And in terms of what that means for the region and the Indo-Pacific, I think that it appears quite clear that these two countries are trying to look for more and more ways to focus on countering the presence and influence of China across this region known as the Indo-Pacific. And I think for both New Delhi and Washington, that now entails the Indian Ocean region and the Pacific Ocean region. And, we hear a lot about how the US and India partner in the Quad and how that impacts cooperation in the Pacific part of the Indo-Pacific. Of the state visit, this was to establish a new dialogue on the Indian Ocean, which means that you're going to see the US and India cooperating a lot more on efforts to counter China in a region close to South Asia, the Indian Ocean region, the western reaches of the Indian Ocean region, where the U.S. and India both worry about what they believe to be a deeper and increasingly threatening Chinese naval presence. It also entails concerns about the Chinese presence along the border with India. So what this means is that we're going to see the U.S. and India partnering a lot more. What that actually means in terms of operationally, it's unclear. The U.S. and India are not allies. They have not signed a mutual defense pact. They're not going to fight wars alongside each other. But I do think this entails the U.S. sharing a lot more intelligence and sending a lot more arms to India to try to strengthen its capacity to deter China. I know that many in Pakistan will fear that this means that the U.S. will be strengthening India's capacity to deter Pakistan. My sense, though, is that India's major security concern, by its own perception, is China, not Pakistan. But I certainly understand, given the sensitivities and the history here, that many will fear that this deepening U.S.-India security partnership could threaten Pakistan as well. But I really think it's China focused. Well, India just wants to be a bigger part of world affairs. And it sees itself as a major power. It sees itself as a rising power, and I think it is a rising power, strictly based on its economic clout and its military modernization. And so it wants to, play a role in these very influential global forums and entities. The Quad is, of course, a group that's really enjoyed a lot of momentum over the last few years. And, India wants to work with like-minded partners, the Quad countries, to counter China. And that should not be necessarily taken as a security-driven objective. I think a major focus of the Quad is to come up with initiatives that finance, generate, and distribute public goods across the Indo-Pacific so that it's to counter what China is doing. So, vaccine production, clean energy technologies, infrastructure, all of this stuff. The Quad wants to work together to produce these types of goods to disseminate across the Indo-Pacific, which is something that China has been doing. But also India, of course, like the U.S., one of its major goals is to counter China's activities. So that's what I was alluding to before. So I think for India, it's a combination of wanting to play a bigger role in the world stage and wanting to work with like-minded partners to counter China. So that's what drives its membership in the Quad, and that's what drives its membership in some similar entities as well. Yeah, it's a great question. Trade, I think, so often can transcend geopolitical and diplomatic tensions, which might be a lesson for India and Pakistan, quite frankly. But we've seen U.S.-India trade increase in a big way in recent years. But you know what? India-China trade and even U.S.-China trade has been quite robust, especially India-China trade. India's trade with the U.S. on bilateral levels was only a bit higher than India's trade with China over the previous fiscal year, which is really something if you think about the different trajectories of that relationship. And I think that for political reasons, for domestic political consumption, both U.S. and Indian politicians have talked about the need to reduce commercial reliance on China and eventually decouple completely from China economically. But that's very hard to do, right? I mean, the fact that both India and India and the U.S. continue to trade quite heavily with China. In the case of India, you've got Chinese investment in a number of key sectors, automobiles, services, and so many other areas. And I think that the balance sheet is, 3 years after the Ladakh crisis, which plunged India-China relations to a very low level, the only thing that India can show for its attempts to decouple from China economically are the bans on apps that were imposed about several years ago, and have been several hundred altogether. But I don't know how well enforced those are at the end of the day. And meanwhile, trade and investment has continued. So, but again, the broader goal of U.S.-India partnership, sort of taking things beyond the basic issue of trade relations, one of the goals of the U.S. and India is to strengthen India's presence in global supply chains, particularly for critical and emerging technologies. And that entails trying to equip India with the capacity to produce semiconductors, all in an effort to reduce the reliance that the world has had on Chinese supply chains for so many critical and emerging technologies. Well, honestly, I think it was very successful in the sense that the goal of the trip was to showcase the depths of U.S.-India partnership. And for a state visit, it's very prestigious. It doesn't happen that often. You knew there was going to be a lot of pomp and circumstance, which there was. And yet there was also a lot of substance. You had a number of agreements across a wide variety of sectors that appeared in the joint statement. And, I think getting to the optics, it's interesting because, some observers and some critics have thought that it may have been wise for President Biden to send a subtle signal to Modi about the administration's concerns about rights and democracy issues in India by maybe not opting for the strong, deep public hug or public embrace that we've come to see with U.S. and Indian leaders. It didn't happen, though. There's a lot of affection between the two men, which I think conveyed the sense of warmth that the relationship enjoys now. So naturally, critics of U.S. policy toward India will not like that. But it was, I would argue that it really was a successful visit in the sense that, the symbolism or the substance equaled the symbolism in this case, that you had so much happening on the pomp and circumstance side, but you just had a lot of deals that were made. A number of trade disputes were announced to have been solved. There were even some surprises, India joining this big U.S. space cooperation mechanism, the Artemis Accords. Just a lot of things to go around that suggest that the relationship is in a pretty good place. And just the vibe in D.C., to be very honest, over the last few days, being in the room and some of these activities focused on the visit, people seem very happy, very optimistic. So I know it may not be what some in Pakistan want to hear, but the reality is this is a very deep relationship right now.